Good afternoon, everybody. I am Johannes Bauer. I am a professor in the Department of Media and Information here at Michigan State University. And I welcome you all to this afternoon's talk. On behalf of the Quello Center, I would also like to welcome the online audience. We are live streaming this. And I'm very glad and I'm very proud and privileged to introduce today Kentaro Toyama, who is the W.K. Kellogg professor at Michigan State, at the University of Michigan. I wish he were here, actually. He has a long and diverse career in the field that probably could be most broadly be construed as information communications technology and development. He is a co-founder of Microsoft India, and I'm sure he will touch upon some of the work, but as part of that role, he engaged his team in India in an innovative and really leading research program on how information communication technology could be used to improve society. He also founded with researchers at Berkeley and at Carnegie Mellon University an international conference dealing with information communication and development that is among the most prestigious conferences in the field currently. And a few years ago, he started to think about a new movement that is now branded as iSchools for Change. And I'm, again, sure he will say more about this, spearheading a national but also global movement to help utilize information technology to help and support positive social change. Kentaro is also very well known for a provocative book that he wrote a few years ago called Geek Heresy, on how to change the narrative that the technology companies give us and save society from the narrative of those companies. And again, I think he will probably say more about this. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Kentaro Toyama. Please help me welcome him.
Thank you, Johannes, and thank you all for being here. Thanks for hosting me. It's really a pleasure to be here. The title of my talk is Where's Digital Technology's Ralph Nader? And I'll explain who Ralph Nader is probably about halfway into the talk for those of you who may not know. But this was a question that was actually posed to me by a journalist at one point, and you'll hear why this is the title of my talk. I'm going to begin with a topic that most of you will probably have heard about, which is fake news. This is this idea that increasingly there are all kinds of non-true news stories that are out there, often with a political aim, and that spread very quickly online. The thing about fake news, of course, is that it has been around for as long as there's been news, which is to say probably as old as human civilization. Back in the even before digital technology was mainstream, there were plenty of tabloid newspapers that were basically conveying some kind of news that was less than true, and some people believe these news articles. So one of the big questions is, why is this fundamentally different? Why has something changed as a result of digital technology? Now, if you believe that social media technology or digital technology is at fault for the spread of fake news, then one way to combat these problems is to think about technological ways to detect fake news and also to either suppress it or to inhibit its spread. And I have lots of colleagues, my background is in computer science, I have lots of colleagues who work on exactly those kinds of technologies. Can you identify fake news based on its source? Can you identify it based on the actual content? And if you can, what are ways in which you can slow down its spread online? And these are all tend to be generated from people who have a computer science background or an engineering background, and so on. But I'm going to suggest that that's not enough, right? So if you kind of study the way that Facebook, for example, has responded to fake news, then what you find is that this is Mark Zuckerberg, CEO of Facebook, and his initial reaction to the accusation that Facebook had anything to do with fake news was to say exactly this, which is that of all the content on Facebook, more than 99% of what people see is authentic. Right? So it can't possibly be that fake news is a significant problem. Now, I would say technically he's probably right, right? More than 99% of the content on Facebook is authentic in the sense that it's about what people just ate, or the cutest cat video that people found. But of that portion that is news, people have studied how much fake news has actually been shared and so on, and there are estimates that anywhere from 10 to 30% of the news around the last presidential election in the United States was actually fake news. So that's a considerable amount of the news itself. Now, Mark Zuckerberg's original intent was to basically suggest that fake news was not a significant challenge on Facebook or on other social media platforms. And here I think it's really important to understand what the overall goals and intentions are of these large media and technology companies. So this is another very old movie, but how many people have heard of The Matrix or have seen it? Okay, great. I ask this of my students these days, and most of them are like, they were born after this movie, so I'll probably have to stop using this slide eventually. But in The Matrix, there is an advanced technology that basically enslaves human beings, harvests their energy to feed themselves, and then feeds all human beings this illusion of having a pleasant life. And that's science fiction. In the movie, they say that they're about 200 years ahead of the current moment. But I'm going to suggest that that science fiction dystopia is actually much closer to us than you might expect, because, for example, Facebook is an advanced technology that harvests our attention to feed their shareholders, all while offering many of us the illusion of a pleasant social life, right? And I don't mean to pick on Facebook necessarily. Actually, I probably do. But it's not just Facebook. It's certainly many of the large technology companies that influence us today. Their model is to try to keep selling us more things, or to expose us to more of themselves so that they can sell our attention to advertisers. Now, over time, Mark Zuckerberg's own attitude towards fake news shifted. And a lot of that shift is probably because there was a significant public outcry to the spread of fake news on Facebook, and eventually that led to congressional hearings. And people who've basically watched him over time suggest that as a result of the social pressure and as a result of the political pressure, which he's still under, he basically over time changed his mind. And now at this point, Facebook is increasingly interested in finding ways to not only stop fake news, but also to diminish the degree to which particularly hateful content is even posted in the first place on Facebook. And the important lesson that I want to suggest here is that Facebook is a company with a lot of financial resources. If they were really interested in eliminating certain kinds of content, they could easily hire an army of people to do that, as already happens in China with respect to censored content that the Communist Party doesn't like. Or they could work on algorithms that help them detect it so that it doesn't require as many human hands to actually eliminate that content. And probably they're at this point doing something close to both. Now, the important thing is, again, if we didn't convince Facebook that this was a problem, it doesn't make any difference how good the algorithms are that we have for addressing the problem, because Facebook themselves would not have implemented those algorithms, right? So social change is critical before the algorithms and the technology actually make a difference. And one way that I think about this is that for the most part, technology amplifies underlying human forces, not that it improves things outright. So what does that mean? It means in situations where something positive is happening already, then there's a good chance that you add technology and things will get even better. But in situations where the people are indifferent to a particular issue, or the institutions are dysfunctional, or people are actually evil and corrupt, then no amount of technology actually turns that around. And one way I think about this is, basically technology is something that we either individually or as a societally choose to use, and very few of us would choose to use a technology that fundamentally does something that we don't want to do in the first place. This is a lesson that I learned over 5 or 6 years while I was in India working at Microsoft Research India. And there I spent a lot of time working on projects in which the goal was to use a digital technology in some way to support efforts at helping lower income communities with healthcare, with education, with governance, with finance, and so forth. And what I learned over time was that it was very easy to do research projects under very fixed conditions in which we could show a positive outcome with technology. But as soon as we tried to take those projects to a larger scale and have larger impact, we found it very difficult to actually have the technology have some positive impact. And what I eventually came to as a conclusion was that what mattered more than the technology were the partners that we had. You know, if we were working with, let's say, a nonprofit organization that was very good at healthcare and was able to achieve its own goals, then we could often find a way to use technology to help them do it better. But if we were working with an agency that was not particularly good at meeting its own goals, then again, it didn't make a difference how well designed the technology was or how much research we did with respect to finding technological solutions. And since coming back from India, I would say I have seen this exact same situation in other contexts in the United States. So for example, you know, these days, we frequently hear about entire school systems deciding that, you know, because they're not sure that that they have the resources to provide enough teachers for all the students or provide additional supplemental education for students who really need that additional education, that the solution is to give every child an iPad or to give every child a laptop. And increasingly there are now rigorous studies about the effects of this kind of program, and they all show that giving students computers in and of itself doesn't change anything with respect to what they learn. A lot of these studies also show that there are not necessarily attending harms to having that additional technology, but given the costs, it's a significant cost for something that doesn't have an ultimate impact on education. Other things are, you know, I think of amplification as basically explaining why all kinds of positive things happen online, but also all kinds of negative things happen, right? For every community that is able to find itself and share experiences that they can't otherwise share with their physical, real-world friends, there are trolls who are basically saying terrible things about anybody who happens to post a comment that they don't like in some corner of the internet. So positive and negative things also get amplified to equal measure. And finally, one of the interesting things about amplification is sometimes the internet itself amplifies some human phenomena to the point that we suddenly realize it was a thing, even though up until that moment we might not have realized that. So one great example of that is, thanks to the internet and to YouTube, we realize just how much human beings have this interest in seeing cute animals, right? This is not something that I think scientists, you know, psychologists or sociologists studied until the internet, but now all of us know that there's this phenomenon of cute cat videos and so on. And to me, that is a sign that there's some underlying human phenomenon that was always there, but was so subtle that we didn't really think of it as a real phenomenon that got amplified online and which we were able to take notice of. So all of that is to say, again, that technology amplifies underlying human forces. And to make that point in one more way, I'm going to go through several slides which look at larger statistics that show that technology in and of itself doesn't fundamentally make the world a better place, even though that is a strong narrative that both Silicon Valley and many of our political leaders often convey. So in this graph, what you're seeing is this is a graph from the Census Bureau. This bottom green line is the rate of poverty in the United States from about 1960 to the present moment. And if you had extended this line back to 1940, what you would have seen was that there was a steady decline in poverty in the United States until just about 1970. And then since then, the rate of poverty has not really gotten any better. In the same period where no change has happened, we have seen basically an explosion of digital technologies. In fact, almost everything that we think of as modern digital technology has been invented and went mainstream sometime in the last 40 or 50 years. Now, I'm not saying that the technology is the cause of the lack of movement on poverty. I don't think it is. But I do think that any story in which technology is necessarily causing positive change with respect to poverty in this case, that story is obviously flawed. There's something else that needs to happen, and we are not doing that something else. My explanation is that as a society, as a country in the United States, sometime around 1970, we stopped being convinced that poverty itself was a terrible thing. My guess is, roughly half of the country believes that a certain amount of poverty is actually a good thing to make sure that we remain motivated to work hard and to be productive. And so as a result, you take all of these great technologies, but they're not contributing to anything positive with respect to the rate of poverty. Let's take another example. So when social media first became a phenomenon about 10, 15 years ago, I guess 15, 20 years ago now, people used to say, okay, here's this new form of media, new form of communication in which you can better be in touch with individuals that you would not otherwise interact with. Right? So, before we were limited in who we interacted with by our physical constraints, or at least, maybe who we telephoned. But even then, there were, you wouldn't normally call somebody randomly, so only people that you knew. With social media came the opportunity for us to connect with very different kinds of people. We would eventually understand and empathize with people we don't normally interact with. The world would become a more harmonious place as we, understood each other better. There were very serious thinkers and journalists on this topic who thought that the outcome would be there would be more peace and happiness on the planet overall. That has not come to pass. In fact, if anything, political polarization has gotten worse. Right? And some of you study this kind of phenomenon in terms of communication, and the overall consensus is that what happens is with more opportunities for us to connect, we end up being more choosy about who we connect with, and we end up just choosing to connect with the sources of information and with the communities that we already tend to agree with. So, for example, when I was growing up in the 70s, there were really only 4 sources of news on any kind of electronic communication, and that was basically ABC, NBC, CBS, and PBS on TV, right? And everybody knew who Walter Cronkite was, and we all heard the same news and heard the same editorializing. Today, if you lean left, there's a good chance you've seen MSNBC. If you lean right, there's a good chance you watch Fox News. And it is a really interesting study just to watch those channels on the same day. It's not even that the news editorializing is different, it's that they don't even present the same news anymore, right? So things that right-leaning audiences think are interesting news are not being presented to left-leaning audiences and vice versa. So we're no longer living in the same information context. Other scholars call this cyber balkanization or filter bubbles, and something like this is happening. And I would say what's happening is that the technology has amplified our desire to interact with people that we already agree with, right? Instead of amplifying some desire to intentionally interact with people that we disagree with so that we can understand their perspective and challenge ourselves. You might say, well, okay, maybe poverty and political polarization are not getting better. There might be other social issues. This is a graph showing the relative degrees of wealth. And you basically see that there's an increase in inequality over time with the same technologies in place. Sometimes people say, well, now that we have all this technology and sources of information, we should be better aware about certain problems related to, let's say, climate change, and we'll be more likely to change our behavior because we're aware of the problems. Again, our fossil fuel consumption as a planet has only increased over time, despite the fact that most of us are probably more aware of climate change than ever. So all of this is, again, to say that technology amplifies underlying human forces. In all of these cases, what I'm suggesting is that as a society, if not individually, but as a society, we are not sufficiently invested in causing change in all of these issues. We are not sufficiently invested in reducing poverty, reducing inequality, avoiding climate change, or avoiding political polarization. And so as a result, all that the technology does is amplify those trends or do nothing in the cases where we're indifferent. Now, amplification is by no means a new idea. In fact, it has been suggested or mentioned in a variety of contexts. There are economists who have basically proposed models of large-scale economics, which basically suggest that total output is a product of human capital and technology. There are people who study science and technology who basically suggested that technology only amplifies whatever values the underlying society convey. And overall, I tend to agree with all of these kinds of theories. But one thing I will say is that amplification doesn't get as much attention as it could as a theory of technology and society. So if you really believe in amplification at its base level, then it leads to a whole bunch of corollaries that almost follow deductively from the original idea. So for example, if you believe in amplification, then it becomes immediately clear that in any situation where the human stakeholders are ultimately not focused on achieving some goal, then no amount of technology will change that. Right? Because the underlying human forces are not headed in that direction, so technology won't amplify that. Or if you believe there's some context in which some institution is fundamentally dysfunctional, like maybe you have a government that is not able to deliver certain kinds of services, or it's corrupt and not serving its citizens, then again, no amount of technology will change that. All that happens is you put the technology there, and either the government will find a way to work around it, shut it off, or possibly even appropriate it for its own less than positive purposes. And then the other thing that I think is naturally falls out of amplification is that in any situation where society is trending towards greater inequality, whether it is economic inequality or social inequality or other forms of inequality, again, technology just tends to amplify that. And the only way to address these things is basically to address the underlying human forces first. As a theory, I think of amplification as being somewhat neutral with respect to the overall valuation of technology. I don't think amplification says technology is good or bad. In fact, it tends to suggest it's actually neutral in and of itself. Most of you will have heard about theories of technological determinism or social determinism, and I think amplification leans towards social determinism, right? Most of the reason why things happen in the world has an underlying social cause that technology then amplifies. There is a little bit of tech determinism, though, in that in contexts where the underlying human forces are almost very stable and largely unchanging, then you can kind of predict what the technology is going to do on top of it. And in fact, I think it kind of hints at a potential reconciliation of these views of technological determinism and social determinism, where tech determinism is actually reasonably right in contexts where human forces are, again, stable and predictable. But that doesn't mean that they're completely up to the technology. There's still potential human agency in changing those things. And then finally, in a lot of kind of theorization around technology and society, there are questions of whether technology is just a tool that people put to their purpose, or if it carries its own values. And I think amplification actually suggests it could be both. It tends towards instrumental thinking, and I think for the most part, that's the way I think of technology, because I think it's more useful to think of it that way in thinking of what its potential outcomes are. But technologies also carry to some extent and amplify to some extent the values of their creators, right? So to the extent that technologies have physical form and outlast the original moment of creation, they maintain a certain they kind of have a momentum that carries forward for the original reasons why the technology was designed. Okay, I'm going to switch direction a little bit and talk a little bit about, first of all, how this theory, I think, has had some impact on the larger world outside of scholarship. So in 2011, I published a paper in which I tried to kind of summarize my thoughts on amplification. Being an academic, that was the natural thing for me. And then I really wanted to actually get this message out to a larger public. So I spent several years trying to publish a book. There's a book now called Geek Heresy that Johannes alluded to. And this book, it kind of expands on that paper and then goes on to some other things that I think are important for what exactly you need to do to change the world in a positive way that is really about changing underlying human forces. The book came out in 2015, and to some extent it hit what I was hoping was the target audience. So I had two kinds of audiences in mind. One were people who worked in international development, which is really my field, and who were interested in using technology. And then the other were people who are in the technology sector who were increasingly thinking about how to use technology for positive social change. And in each of these areas, I've since found that there's a reason the book has been reasonably, at least if not outright read, people know about it. The World Bank releases an annual development report. That's kind of its flagship publication. And in 2016, it was about what they call digital dividends. What is the potential for digital technology to impact international development? And they cited my work. I was in communication with the people who wrote that report. And their ultimate conclusion was very similar to mine. They thought of it in terms of, in order to have positive benefit with digital technology, your what they called the analog layer had to be in place, meaning that human institutions and human politics had to be going in the right direction first. In the top left, you see Satya Nadella. He's the current CEO of Microsoft. Without my knowing, he started quoting my book in certain contexts, and he had obviously was familiar with it. He's from India himself, so I think he was particularly interested in the stories I had to tell about India. There was also some reference in the larger public sphere. There were New York Times articles that were that referenced, to what degree can we rely on technology to cause positive change. But having said all of that, I was very happy about that. It was personally gratifying, but not much really changed. So in international development, I would say there's really not been any slowdown in attempts to solve the problems of the challenges of international development through technology. Interestingly, in a video that Satya Nadella has online where he mentions my book, literally minutes later, there are a stream of Microsoft executives talking about how technology is going to help you solve the problems of education. And then I would say, despite the fact that we are increasingly concerned about some of the negative impacts of technology, public sentiment about these things tends to be based on crises. Like it's when there's some crisis that we suddenly care about the issue. But until those crises happen, we're quite willing to ignore the issue. So overall, I was still very dissatisfied with the impact of the book, as well as I think there's quite a few other people have increasingly been talking about the negative sides of technology, and really not much progress has been made. There hasn't been major legislation in the United States that attempts to regulate or otherwise adjust the degree to which technology has been impacting us. I am at a school of information, which was formerly a library science school. And so, since I moved there 5 years ago, I've had a reasonable amount of interaction with people who are connected to library science. And library science has an interesting history in that, they are the original kind of schools of information. But one thing about them is they've had, I would say, they've had something like a loss of self-esteem as a result of this change in what information overall means. So, once upon a time there were libraries and library science schools, and suddenly there was this thing called digital technology. And I think, a lot of my library science colleagues feel like they have been completely crushed and eclipsed by interest in digital technology and so forth. But I actually think there's a very different narrative about the role of information science and library science. And that is that once upon a time there were these very specialized professions called librarians. And they were the ones who knew how to search for information. They could tell you where to go if you wanted a certain kind of information. They were experts at curating information. They were good at archiving things, so on and so forth. And today, thanks to the widespread use of very sophisticated information technologies, all of us have basically become de facto librarians. Right? So for example, all of us are now reasonably good at seeking out information online. All of us have to do this funny thing where we curate and decide what kinds of media and photographs and videos we're going to maintain on our smartphones, which are basically miniature libraries. All of us have become archivists in terms of, okay, what do I do with all of these photographs that I definitely don't want to lose, right? And so without necessarily the formal training of librarians and archivists, we've suddenly had to do these things. And so as a result, I started looking at the history of library science and how it was actually more involved in some of these social questions around technology and or around information. And this is what I found. So fake news, again, as I mentioned, there's a long history of things that are fake news. Today, if you go to the technology sector, what you'll find is that with the rise in innovation in, let's say, artificial intelligence, increasingly there will be more and more fake news that's probably generated by a computer. Right? And there's no obvious fix to this problem. If you go back in the history of library sciences, a lot of librarians and people associated with libraries, they saw this problem in the early days of newspapers and said, hey, we need to educate the public about how to be critical readers of the news. It's not enough that the information is available, but we need to make sure everybody's actually literate and thinking critically about the news they read. Many of us are increasingly worried about privacy, about the data that is available to governments and corporations. Again, neither of these entities appears to be doing that much to help figure this out, although the situation is different in every country. In some contexts, there's a potential marriage between government and corporations in terms of how big data is going to be used against us. What you're seeing here is a story about the social credit scores in China, where basically the government is increasingly trying to centralize data about individuals as a way to eventually give everybody a scorecard about how trustworthy they are. And other individuals will have access to that, so you could basically say, okay, this is somebody I want to do business with, or this is someone I want to be friends with, all based on information that the government and large corporations are gathering. Again, it turns out in the history of libraries that librarians were one of the first at the forefront of the movement of privacy around information. So long before computer scientists were thinking about security and privacy, librarians instituted a code of ethics for libraries in which they wanted to protect the privacy of the people who came to libraries seeking information. And in fact, in the 60s and 70s, librarians often took a very hard stand, which was, we are not going to track information about who visits libraries, because if we have that information subpoenaed, we would be required to hand over to the government information about who's seeking what kind of information, who's checking out what kind of books, and we believe that's an invasion of privacy, and that is not upholding human rights. Let's talk about different issues. So, we have seen lots of news about police shootings, often of black Americans. And again, if you turn to the technology world, they are only amplifying the underlying racist systems in the world today. And again, if you look at the history of libraries, there are lots of situations where libraries have basically opened up their doors to communities while they were protesting against racist incidents and so forth. And so, this is a community that as a whole has been very active against challenges with information from well before the time that there was actually digital technology. Now, you've heard me talk about corporations and governments. Basically, I see the world like this. Okay, so this is from Godzilla. There are these huge, giant institutions that really individually we have no power over, right? And most of us are like these people. It's potentially very demoralizing, right? Like, none of us individually have the power to change policy at Google. None of us individually have the power to change federal policy about regulation. But there are ways in history where people have challenged existing systems of power, and they have done it very effectively. So I'm going to tell you a story about a very different technology. So there's the auto industry. So in the 1940s and 50s, there were no standards around automobile safety, okay, zero. So automobile companies were in many ways like the technology companies of today. They had a lot of power. They had generated large amounts of wealth. They were widely seen by much of society as being a desirable source of employment and economic growth. But there was no real regulation around the potential safety around cars. Pretty much one man made that situation and put it on the agenda for public discussion. And that's Ralph Nader. He's pictured in here. And in 1965, he published his book, Unsafe at Any Speed. He was a lawyer by training, and what he did was to uncover all kinds of information that suggested that, first of all, that there was a lot that car companies could do to make cars safer, but they intentionally did not for business reasons. And also that they were outright, in many cases, if not hiding, at least trying to deflect attention from that possibility. The car company's major concern was that in order to do something that made cars safer, they would have to increase the price of cars, and that would reduce the number of customers and therefore their profits. And he also suggested that in some cases, these car companies were, fundamentally far more willing to spend money on things like, changing something so that it looked good rather than spending a few pennies on something like safety belts. And this book got national attention, and it got so much attention that he started getting harassed by car companies. So he eventually filed a lawsuit against General Motors because they did some things that you would just not believe. Like they personally came after him, they tried to harass him, they intimidated him. They apparently would send him women that would try to invite him into compromising sexual relationships and so on. And he ultimately won this case, won I think around $400,000. From General Motors, and then started a organization whose name escapes me, but it's basically the Center for, I think it's a Center for Law and Responsibility, where he was interested in forming an institution that basically kept after large corporations and ensuring that they were doing the right thing. A year after his book, Congress passed legislation to, first of all, instate a new institution, the National Highway and Traffic Safety Commission, which still exists today. And they started a provision by which a number of safety laws could be instated by that particular organization, right? And since then, we now have seatbelts, we now have airbags, and so forth. And it turns out that car companies did not suffer. People were actually more willing to buy cars once they knew that there were safety features in them as well. And here's a statement as to just how influential he was. So this is the then House Speaker John McCormack basically saying that this traffic safety bill that they passed was in part due to the crusading spirit of one individual who believed he could do something, Ralph Nader. Okay, so it's, if you think about, okay, what can one person do? This is an incredible testament to the possibility of one determined person. And what's amazing is, this book was published in 1965. 1 year later, there was legislation to address this particular concern. Now, I actually think this is nearly impossible to do today. And I think there's a number of reasons for it. One of them is that there's just simply many more issues competing for attention, right? We are in a world in which there just seem to be all kinds of crises and situations that we need to address. On top of that, there's much greater political polarization, as you saw in the earlier graph, and there's congressional gridlock. There is more sophistication on the part of the companies, both with respect to their PR, but also with respect to corporate lobbying. These days, any company with a decent revenue, basically, as a matter of course, will hire lobbyists in DC to make sure that their interests are met. And there are analyses about what the value of that lobbying is, and some of the analyses are, they suggest returns on the order of like 10,000 times the investment in lobbying. Right? So oftentimes companies get billions of dollars of benefit from spending a few $1 million lobbying. So companies themselves are becoming more sophisticated about this. I think with digital technology, there's also the challenge that on the one hand, it's very seductive. Like very few of us would probably, forego using our smartphones or using Facebook. And so there's a positive side that we don't want to let go. But at the same time, the harm is more subtle. Right? Like, in a car crash, somebody dies. With somebody selling our data online, it's not really clear that the harm is so terrible, right? So it's much easier to forgive. And the issues are complex. So again, it's not really clear exactly how the data is being gathered, what kind of data is being gathered, who the data is being sold to, and how that ultimately impacts us. And that lack of clarity and the difficulty of telling a clear narrative about it also makes it much harder of an issue to raise with the public itself. And then finally, I think there's less of an understanding, interestingly, in our generation than with previous generations in terms of the political power that we have and how to exert it. So partly as a result of my personal interest in moving policy, I've started studying things about how social movements happen and how people who are activists actually try to get legislation changed. And there's some surprising things I've learned. So for example, most people in Congress, senators and people in the members of the House of Representatives, they have staff who regularly monitor the incoming communication that they receive from their constituents. If an issue, here's the amazing thing: if they receive a certain number of phone calls about a specific issue, that issue will get heard by the member of Congress. Okay, how many calls do you think that is? Roughly? 1,000. 1,000? 100? Anybody else? 5? Yeah, so 5 is correct as order of magnitude. Yeah, so it depends on the office, but like between 5 to 10 phone calls on any specific issue, and that member of Congress will definitely hear about it from their staff. And that's just phone calls, right? So I've run into several organizations whose primary means of changing the world is basically they get an army of volunteers in various states to make these phone calls, right? Because if you can just get 5 people to call about something, there's a good chance that legislator will hear about it, and at least it will be on their radar. Obviously, it takes more effort for them to take the issue seriously and for it to become a bill and so forth. But it's surprisingly the power you need to move those levers is surprisingly small. I think as a society we've forgotten these things. So again, in Ralph Nader's era, I have a feeling, if not, it wasn't just him who understood that these things can be changed based on human effort. I think something's happened in our generation where we assume if you can't do it while clicking a mouse, it's not doable. Right? So a lot of my students can't conceive of this idea of even picking up the phone to call up your congressperson. They're like, well, what would I say? And so you have to make sure people understand. You just have to talk, in a very natural way about the issues you're concerned about, which is something that many of our parents did on a regular basis with their congresspeople, and those issues got heard. Now, social movements are in themselves a significant area of study. This is not my area of expertise, but most of you are aware of these, at least in the background. So for example, abolition, the movement to eliminate slavery, was a several hundred-year-long social movement that was sustained over time by lots of little organizations working together. The movement for women's suffrage to get the vote for women in the United States began in the mid-19th century, and it took about 100 to 120 years for that to be realized. But ultimately, it was realized again, when they began, probably nobody in the world thought that was ever going to happen. More recently, we've seen gay rights take hold, and things like the fact that now their marriage is recognized in every state in this country between people who are of the same gender. That's a surprising thing, and that probably was a social movement that took between 30 to 40 years to really reach its eventual goals. So all of these are situations in which, as people working together in collectives trying to change certain things ultimately succeeded. And I believe we need to do the same thing. And what it takes is a sustained social movement, right? It's not enough to have one protest. It's not enough to do one online petition. It's not enough to have one paper written about a particular issue. You basically have to keep at it, keep pushing, and keep making forward progress despite whatever setbacks. And as you saw in the big Godzilla image, the challenge is that the companies are doing this already with their immense resources. right? And the only way we can fight that kind of power is if we act collectively. And what I'm going to suggest is that in the world of digital technology, those of us who are in information-related schools at universities are actually uniquely positioned to work together as a group to try to affect both the way corporations design and use technology and also affect government policy around technology. And there are a bunch of reasons for that. One is that, again, it requires a sustained movement. And the sustaining part is very difficult if you're going to, if you don't have an organization that is somehow funded in a way that's likely to last. And universities have now been around for millennia. I would guess that, long after some of these tech companies have collapsed, there will still be schools of information or something like them. And so that's a good basis to start. We, of course, as a community, have the expertise on these issues. We are people who think about these issues, who care about the issues, who have often policy recommendations about them. Many of us come from, again, library science backgrounds in which there is already an existing kind of social impact tradition, even if that has temporarily halted. And I think in many ways, we're organizations that have the public trust. Right? We are neither corporations nor are we the government. And so we have a certain kind of standing that I think many other organizations don't have. So for all these reasons, I think we're a good potential